Welcome to the Politics and Media programme. The national census results published last week gave us a striking picture of multicultural Britain. Since the last census a decade ago, white Britons in London have become a minority, making up 45% of the capital's population. The number of Christians is down, the number of Muslims, Hindus and Buddhists has risen. So is this a success story that we should all celebrate, or do the statistics reveal problems that are going unaddressed by the political mainstream? Is there a problem of integration, as many politicians seem to think? Charlotte Hawkins has this report.
The 2011 census results are in, and many have been shocked to hear that white British people in London are now a minority. With other ethnic groups now making up 55% of Londoners, immigration and multiculturalism are firmly back on the political agenda. Labour leader Ed Miliband gave a speech on Friday outlining his plans for a new integration policy.
See, separation means isolation, and you can't succeed in Britain if you're isolated. How does conversation and connection happen? It happens through dialogue and discussion. And you can't do that unless you share a common language.
Miliband wants to ban those without good level of English from certain public sector jobs. He also said he would tackle rogue landlords who exploit new immigrants in overcrowded housing, and that schools and parents will be encouraged to share responsibility for helping foreign-born children learn English.
I think what's happened is that we haven't done enough, governments of both parties, to help people integrate. Now, in many places they have integrated, but the reason I emphasised in my speech today the importance of language, tackling slum housing, the workplace, is that we can't just let integration take care of itself. We've actually got to deal with it. But assimilation, which is submerge your identity, you must leave your culture, your religion, at the door when you come into Britain. That's not good for our country, and it's not the way our country works. Our country actually is brilliant in its diversity. We need to just make it work everywhere and for everybody. And that's why integration, I think, is important. Language, housing, workplace, all of those things, they really matter and they can really make a difference. One thing that the Muslim community is doing in many places and probably could do more of is actually being the people themselves who are passing on English teaching. So encouraging people to take English classes and perhaps even putting on the classes themselves. And I think the Muslim community in Britain is doing a lot of that already, and that can really, really help integrate people into British society.
Prime Minister David Cameron criticised Miliband's comments and has challenged him to explain why he had supported past Labour government's policies on what Cameron described as unchecked immigration. The results of the census show that accepting other cultures and improving integration is now more important than ever. 1 in 8 people now in England and Wales are born outside of the UK, with the majority coming from India, Pakistan and Poland. While traditionally viewed as a Christian country, in fact the Christian population has dropped by 13 percentage points to 59%, whereas the Muslim population has grown to reach nearly 5%. Muslims channel.
So has government policy created parallel societies? With me in the studio to discuss the issues are David Vos, Professor of Population Studies at Essex University, and Professor Linda Woodhead from the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
David, let's see if we can just sort of unpack some of those statistics. I mean, we gave the headline statistic, it's been in the news that the minority of Londoners are now white British,
yes. But
actually perhaps that would be read on some sections of the political spectrum as saying, well, there's a lot more Muslims or Asians or blacks, but actually it's more likely to be white Europeans that have tipped the balance, isn't it?
there is an awful lot of immigration from Eastern Europe. That's certainly true. The fact that Poland is the third country that was named is indicative. So the key thing about London, I think, is just that it's extremely diverse. It's not that there's been a very large increase in any particular subpopulation. It's just that there are lots of different kinds of people living here.
Linda, let's just get that argument straight, because as I say, lots of people, when they hear immigration, think Asian or Afro-Caribbean, but actually the big story of the last 10 years is the opening up to Eastern Europe, isn't it?
It is, and actually if you look at religious immigration, I think it's true still that the largest immigrant religion is Christianity. I mean, that's not the one that usually gets the headlines. And of course, this huge diversity is really a feature of London. If we look at England and Wales as a whole, I think the figure is 80% for white British and 86% for white. And if you add in Scotland as well, it's even more strongly white. So focusing on London isn't the whole picture.
And what about the figures for the drop in what are described as Christians in the thing? Because it's given as a drop of, I don't know, 70% to 59% or something, I think, between the two censuses. But actually, when you ask the question how many people are practicing Christians, I think other surveys give that at about 6%. So kind of what's really being answered there is what religion were you born into, or what religion was your family, isn't it?
It's certainly very important with the census to appreciate that what's being asked for is self-identification. So it's not belief and it's not practice. The census has one very specific question on religion, and as you say, that's arguably more to do with cultural heritage than it is with what we might think of as active religiosity.
And Linda, I mean, away from or connected, I suppose, to the immigration debate is quite a striking statistic which nobody's really commented on, and that is that the population is ageing and would be ageing more rapidly if it weren't for immigration.
That's certainly true. It's true as well, if you look at, just going back to your point about religion, Christianity is a very ageing population. The population in the churches, it's overrepresented amongst the older generation. So there's a problem there for the churches and for retaining a Christian culture that younger generations increasingly seem to be ticking the no religion box rather than the Christian box. So it's certainly true that the cultural profile and the religious profile of the country is changing quite significantly. The census does give us that information.
And interestingly, in its response, the Muslim Council of Britain pointed out, I think, that although there's an increase in Muslims recorded in the survey, there's an even bigger increase in Buddhists and Hindus, which perhaps people wouldn't expect.
I don't think it's even larger. The Muslim figure has gone up by about 75%, but it's true that's the same order of magnitude as Hindus, not quite 50% increase, Buddhists, again, quite a high increase. So the basic point is correct that all religious minority groups have increased significantly in size, actually with the exception of the Jewish population that has basically stayed stable.
What do you make of those figures, Linda?
It's hard. I mean, it's hard to read too much into the census because, as David said, it's one question about adherence, and it's a very politicised question. So you get a lot of groups campaigning to get their followers to tick the box. And of course, minorities have always got a much bigger reason for standing up and being counted and for saying, here we are and we need special services and pay attention to us than majority populations have. And some of the religious minorities have also been more clear and vociferous, partly in relation to the visibility of Islam. As that's become increasingly increasingly visible, other religious minorities have felt, hey, what about us? We're maybe being left out here. So it may be partly about growth of the population, but also just about more people identifying themselves with their religion in that way.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, I don't think I've been aware of that, and I don't think it's been covered in the press at all. That are you saying that there's a kind of active campaign by religious minorities among their congregations, so to say, to register in the census, a direct kind of?
Yes, there have been. Some groups have actively done that. You can see that in the other category as well, where some groups are. You can name your group if you're not on the official list, and there have been some quite active and successful campaigns to do that. My point about this sense that Islam's getting all the limelight, that was partly because of the government's initiatives like the Prevent funding, which gave some groups saw it as special privileging to Islam, so other religious minorities want to become more visible. Some formal campaigning, but some I think probably just more an informal sense and talking to one another in a sense that we ought to mark the fact that we do have this religious identity and it should count in the UK.
David, what do you make of Miliband's speech? Because he seems to be wanting to have his cake and eat it, to appeal to those sections of religious minorities or immigrant populations who might vote Labour, and to cast himself as their ally, but at the same time not really willing to wholly break with the kind of agenda that Cameron's been setting. Is that fair?
Yes, I think an awful lot of what he said is for general political consumption. I mean, the idea of, for example, not employing people in the public sector unless they have good English. Well, for most public sector jobs, you're not going to be employed anyway unless you have good English. The only point of making that some kind of legal requirement is simply in order to say that you've done something. So that does seem to me to be grandstanding.
And do you think it's fair criticism of Miliband that on the one hand he wants to praise the virtues of immigration, and at the same time is apologising for the last Labour government having let these people in? I mean, it's either one or the other, surely, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's frustrating in a way when you have these speeches that no one actually says what's the problem here. You know, what is the problem with diversity and integration? If you could name exactly what the problem is, you could then have a clear solution to it. He didn't actually say what the problem is. Yes, there's increasing level of diversity. So you get a bit of a kind of Aunt Sally set up, which is multiculturalism, meaning completely separate communities who live parallel lives and never speak to each other. Well, we're all against that, aren't we? Well, yes, everyone's against that, and actually no one ever advocated that. No proponent of multiculturalism ever said, let's live completely parallel lives. So that's just a kind of politician's symbolic football to kick around. And I think it really does need, I think that speech showed on both sides of the political spectrum, really, there needs to be a lot more attention to what is going wrong, if anything, and if so, how do we put it right? And actually, I run a very large research programme, and it's been looking at religion across the UK, and lots of multi-faith and multicultural endeavours, which are extremely successful. In many ways, the UK, well, I think it is at the forefront of multicultural, multi-faith societies in Europe. In some ways, it's actually now more advanced than the USA in terms of successful integration of an extremely diverse population, both in terms of class and levels of income as well as race. And yet that story is not really celebrated by politicians. It was celebrated in the Olympics, interestingly. I think there's a wider sense amongst the population that a quite remarkable transformation has taken place actually very smoothly. And yet the political rhetoric doesn't really acknowledge it as a good news story at all. It's a kind of diffuse problem that no one quite names. I
mean, David, you've written, I think, a little bit about the fact that these communities arrive mainly out of poverty or because of difficulties of language. They tend to group together in the first generation, and then there tends to be a dispersal in the wider population. But this allows any politician at one particular point in time to say, look at the Jews in the East End. If we were talking about the beginning of the century, if they aren't integrating, a generation later, it's the same argument, but a different group of people. Is this what's happening?
Yes, I think it is. You know, it's historically the case that with every large immigrant group, there has been a reaction against them, and people saying that they're going to be very difficult to assimilate or integrate, and lo and behold, within a generation or two, they do and are actually seen as making a major contribution to the population. I mean, it's remarkable that the 1924 Immigration Act in the United States that basically cut off the flow of immigration to that country was specifically aimed at Jews and East Asians who are now seen as being kind of model citizens and exactly the sort of people that one would wish to have in the country. So it doesn't take all that long for things to change, but of course we're viewing that in historical time, and at any particular point, particularly early on in the process, there is an awful lot of anxiety.
Linda, do you think that perhaps too much is even made of the argument about living separately? I mean, is there anything particularly wrong with a group of people who, you know, for various reasons might decide that they need a community support network living in a particular area? I mean, nobody's found that much of a problem with walking down Brick Lane recently, so what's the issue there?
That's a very good question that's not asked often enough. I mean, in fact, the population that is least integrated is white British. Other smaller groups have to integrate. They have to get along with the majority culture, and they do over time, as David just said. But you're right also that there have always been religious groups who've wanted to keep themselves completely to themselves. There are Christian groups like the Plymouth Brethren. There are Orthodox Jewish groups who live very separate lives and yet who are felt to be making a very important contribution. They've been here a long time. They're an essential part of British life. So again, you have to ask, what exactly is the problem in these groups? As you intimated, if you can't walk in that area without threat of violence, that's a problem. But it's too easy to say this is just wrong per se without thinking about the fact that we have actually had this for a very long time. And if you look at European history, that's a very long and established pattern of having groups living peacefully side by side. And as you say, there are many benefits in terms of mutual support for new groups entering a country in that way also.
I mean, one argument that you will get from the right, and indeed it was perhaps predictably enough in the Daily Telegraph in response to the census, was that you know, Ed Miliband shouldn't be making these kind of speeches because the previous government let a lot of people in here, and that's what the problem is with poverty and poor housing. I mean, that's a stock argument, but is there any basis to that argument, do you think?
There's clearly a problem of integration. The question is, where does that problem come from? And I think the honest answer is that there has to be will on both sides to integrate. The majority community has to be willing to make some sort of efforts to reach out and see the new arrivals as neighbours, and the new neighbours, newly arrived, have to think of themselves as part of the society and adapt accordingly. This is a very complex matter that involves all sorts of difficult decisions on both sides.
I mean, Linda, we've been talking about, I mean, as David put it, we've been talking in kind of historical time, you know, relatively long periods of time here. But as each generation finds, it's not quite that if you are patient and wait long enough, it all comes to you. I mean, people have to fight their way in, don't they? There's a process of contestation which has to be won and could be not won here.
There is, and very often immigrant groups work much harder, push their kids very strongly, invest hugely in the education of their children. You see an overachievement often amongst those groups and their children. I mean, some of the groups that are doing very badly and where there should be concern in Britain at the moment are white working class males. I come from up north. There are still serious problems in East Lancashire, but often it's the traditional white communities who are very much stuck in certain cultural patterns and in poverty, which are causing part of the problem. So it's a complex picture, and it does vary as well in different parts of the UK. And if you have areas of low unemployment and so on, obviously it's very much harder. Integration often takes place not just on the streets in the neighbourhood, but in the workplace. If there aren't jobs, that's another whole level of problem.
And there will be, as there have been for other groups in the past. I mean, if you talk to people who were engaged in the struggles in the 1930s in the Jewish community, they'll say about Cable Street, and they'll say about the first Jewish councillors elected in the East End, and so on and so forth. There's a political contest here to kind of to get integration, isn't there? There
is, and actually, if you go back to the religions question on the census, that was put there for the first time in 2001, partly because of lobbying by Muslims were particularly active in the UK. In doing that, the Muslim Council of Britain had a very strong voice wanting there to be a religion question, precisely so that Muslims could be registered and not just subsumed into a category of Asian. But also the Muslim Council of Britain, of course, is a body put together to try and represent Muslims effectively in the country and to speak to government. It's very hard for religious groups to do that. Religion traditionally, of course, was represented through the National Church, the Church of England, the Church of Scotland, which had a direct route to government. New religions coming, Jews being the oldest, have tried to form something quite similar that can look a bit like that can have a national representative voice. That's very hard for religions like Hinduism or Islam, which don't, like a church, don't organise themselves in a national way with a single representative figure like that. And I think we have still got a real problem in the UK at the moment about how government interfaces effectively with the whole range of religion and no religion, and that's still to be worked out.
I mean, David, Linda was suggesting earlier that in some ways the sort of increased identification in the census is a product of the sort of attention that's been focused on Islam. That would be quite an irony, wouldn't it? That this really stems out of 9/11 and the whole war on terror, Dialogue That Prevents scheme was a consequence of that. If it turns out that it's actually increased the self-identification of both Islam and other religions, that'll be quite an irony from the government's point of view.
Perhaps. I think the census question in 2001 was put there specifically in order to identify the minority religious groups, and I think it was extremely successful at doing that. It did give us a very good count that we hadn't before of Muslims, Hindus and others. It was markedly unsuccessful, in my view, at enumerating Christians versus people of no religion. And part of the reason for that, I think, was that the Christian numbers were to some degree infected by a sort of reactive sense of identity that maybe was more about not being Muslim, Hindu, and so on than it was about being Christian. If that's the case, then the fact that the Christian numbers have fallen so markedly this time round is actually good news, because it suggests that people are perhaps more relaxed about the presence in the country of large numbers of people of other religions.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to stop you there because we're just coming up to the break, but we will be returning to these issues in the second part of the Politics and Media programme, so do rejoin us.